Hey there, I'm so glad you tuned in today. Maybe you can relate to the following statement that I have received repeatedly the last couple of months. And the comment has been, I only knew that I could plant a summer garden. I had no idea before now that there are such things as cool season crops. When I hear this, I am so happy because I know that that person now sees the huge potential for getting so much more out of the garden than just a summer garden. But let's face it, if we're new to planting cool season crops, knowing when to plant is a little bit more tricky than with warm season crops. I mean, with warm season crops like tomatoes and peppers, cucumbers, it's easy to know to wait until after your last frost has passed. And note when I said easy to know when to wait, actually waiting is a whole other thing that we have to battle, right? But what about cool season crops? When do we plant those according to our calendar? Or even if we know when to plant them according to our calendar, according to how we have calculated based on our last frost date, maybe if you're a student of my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden, you've already done this. But what about when the time actually comes? When that week comes that you've scheduled yourself to plant your carrots, your lettuce, your broccoli, is that really the best time to plant? Or are there other signs to look for when you get close to the date that you have already set? We're going to be talking about all of that today so that you can be in a better place to actually get your cool season crops in the ground at the best time so that you can experience success. If you're a new gardener, though, you may be wondering, what are cool season crops? Maybe you have not heard that term in the past. So let's just go over that real quick before we dive into the when, just because I want to make sure that we're on the same page here. So cool season crops are the crops in our garden that can take a frost, and many of them can take a freeze with no problem. The thing that makes them different from warm season crops and even crops that love the heat is that cool season crops don't love the heat. They actually will suffer. Sometimes they'll bolt altogether, which means they'll send up a flower stalk. In the case of lettuce, it'll become bitter, where it's pretty much done for the season. With broccoli, instead of getting a head, it's going to start to separate and flower, and that means it's done for the season. With other crops like carrots, depending on what kind you plant, it could actually create a flower stalk, and also the root itself can become bitter. So all of this happens when it gets too hot. Knowing the role that heat plays with cool season crops, in my opinion, is just as important as understanding that they can take a frost and take a freeze. So I've mentioned a couple examples, but here are some others just to make sure that you're understanding some examples of cool season crops. They're going to be lettuce, broccoli, cabbage, kale, most greens, carrots, beets, onions, spinach, peas. I would list potatoes in that category just because potatoes don't like the heat, but the potato foliage doesn't like a freeze either. So they're kind of that crop that they're a little bit tender to freeze, but they also don't like the heat. So they're kind of like a big asterisk beside potatoes being a cool season crop. But since I'm in the South, I have to treat them that way because I need to get them harvested before the heat sets in, or the harvest will be hampered quite a bit. Those then are some examples of cool season crops. That's by no means an exhaustive list, but that would be the list of probably the most common crops that are grown in a home garden. When then can you expect to plant them if they can take a frost, if they can take a freeze in many cases, if they hate the heat? What does that mean when it comes to when to plant in your garden? Well, it does vary by crop, so it's not super easy where with the warm season crops, you can say just wait till after your frost. With the cool season crops, there is some variability. But I will say when I started looking at all of these crops in my garden, I plant them in the ground around 4 to 6 weeks before my average last frost date. So for context, my average last frost date, it's been varying from year to year, but these days I like to use about April 8th to be safe. It can be before that, can be after that. But if I'm taking April 8th as my average last frost date, then typically I know in my mind that most of these cool season crops I'm going to be getting in the ground around the beginning of March. The first week of March is typically my go time, but that can vary, as we're going to talk about in just a minute. You may be wondering then, why so early? Because most of us don't think about planting our gardens until spring has finally arrived. The grass is starting to get green. But remember, when we're talking about cool season crops, they don't like the heat. So the point of being able to get these crops in the ground so early is to be able to get them in and get them growing and get them harvested before the heat sets in. Now, the most heat sensitive cool season crops that I grow are going to be spinach. For me, spinach starts bolting when the temperatures get in the upper 70s. Usually it's the middle of April. Usually it's right when our average last frost date passes. That's when spinach is usually done in my garden. But behind that, we have lettuce, broccoli, most greens. They are not going to like the heat. For lettuce, broccoli, and many of my greens, in my climate, that means that I need to get them harvested by mid-May. That's usually when they're done, mid to late May. Now, there's some variations there, like some types of lettuce are more heat tolerant than other types of lettuce. And I've started to learn which lettuce is more cold tolerant, like Tango and Winter Density. Those will power through the winter, at least in my winter in Zone 8A, but they are the first usually to get better because they like the cold, but they don't like the heat. And then you've got something like a Muir lettuce, that's spelled M-U-I-R. It's always hard to pronounce for me, but that's one of the longest lasting lettuces in my garden. So sometimes it can last to the beginning of June. But if you're seeing a theme here, it's that they are not going to like the heat. Now, I'm talking to you from an Arkansas garden where we tend to go from cool to hot rather quickly, and we get hot fast in the summer. But not all of you are going to experience that. Many of you don't get your major heat until maybe July, or maybe your summer is mild altogether, typically. Although, as we've seen in the past few years, we know that there definitely can be some heat waves when you least expect them. But for those of you who live in a climate where summer doesn't come as rapidly as it does for us, one thing that I have learned is we typically get to an average of 85-degree highs by the end of May, the beginning of June. And so if you can calculate that when you start to get an average of 85, that's usually, when you can be pretty sure that most of these crops are going to be done. But if you don't get there, or if you don't get there till later in the season, then you're not going to be in as much of a hurry to get these cool season crops in the ground as someone like me who is in a climate where we do get hot pretty fast. Another thing to consider is that even though I've lumped all of these cool season crops into one category, some of them I have found are a little bit less heat sensitive. Now, this is something that I want to encourage you to observe in your garden because I think our own observations are always going to be our best teachers. But if you are a brand new gardener and you want a little bit of direction here, what I have found when I consider these cool season crops is that some varieties of carrots will last longer in the garden than others. New Carota, Napoli, those are two of my staples that I've never had them bolt in my garden. I mean, any kind of carrot that you harvest in the summer is going to be a little bit more tart than the one you harvest in the winter. Those are going to be more sweet. But I found that those typically will last a little bit longer. Last year, I harvested most of these carrots in July with not any problem. But one year, I think it was Baker Creek, sent me a free seed, which they do in their orders, called Uzbek, I believe. And I didn't do any research on this particular carrot. I just planted it. It was a yellow carrot, and I thought this will be cool. It'll be fun. They did not like the heat. They bolted, started producing a flower stalk, very tart, almost, not really bitter necessarily, but very strong, pungent, almost flavor. And I read later that this particular kind of carrot is actually more cold tolerant and is better for a fall or winter crop. So understand that with carrots, certain varieties are going to be a little bit more heat tolerant than others. And seed catalogs are fabulous at communicating that with you. You just really need to know what to look for. For example, there's one carrot variety I'm going to be planting this year that the seed catalog specifically says plant in the fall and winter. And when I see that, I know it's because it's probably not going to like the summer. So, but some of those summer adaptable varieties of carrots, in my experience, can go a lot longer. Like I said, into June last year. I've also found that beets aren't as heat susceptible as I thought they were. They have gone into July as well. Often if I plant them early enough, they don't need to because they size up pretty easily. But I've found that they're not as sensitive. I don't think I've ever had beets bolt on me in the summer. That's just been my experience. And then I also have found that onions aren't as sensitive to heat as I thought. I originally thought that if it got too hot, onions would bolt. And over the years doing study and also observing in my garden, I was realizing that it wasn't necessarily the heat that was causing them to bolt. It was the roller coaster temperatures in the early part of the spring. So what I actually found last year is I got a late start on some of my onions, and while they didn't grow to be huge bulbs, they never bolted. So I found that they weren't as sensitive to heat in particular as they were those roller coaster temperatures in the spring. So that's something to consider. And then cabbage in particular, I have found can go longer without suffering. A lot of times we lump broccoli and cabbage together, but I've found broccoli to be a lot more sensitive. It's more sensitive to cold, so I have to harvest it earlier in the fall, but it's also more sensitive to heat because it has a tendency to bolt, whereas cabbage, in my experience, will go longer in the winter and it'll go longer in the summer if you need it to. So those are some exceptions in particular. So in some of these exceptions, these cool season crops can go well into June and even early July. But as I mentioned, the greens, those are not going to. And that's a lot of times where beginners start. So that's why I wanted to definitely bring that up. If you're growing greens, especially spinach, understand that they don't like the heat, and don't be surprised if they start to bolt early, and just make the adaptation next year to plant earlier. Another thing to consider with cool season crops, as far as encouraging you why to plant so early, is that cool season crops, if you're planting from seed directly in the garden, soil temperature is actually less of a factor with cool season crops as warm season crops when it comes to the spring. And that's because they can handle lower soil temperature and still germinate. Now, they may take longer to germinate. If you're talking about 45, 50 degree soil temperature, they may take longer than if you'd planted those same seeds in the fall when it's, 75, 80 degree soil temperature. But because they're cool season crops, they are adapted to sprout when the soil temperature is lower than when the warm season crops would be adapted to sprout. It just makes sense. If they're going to grow better in the cool season, they're going to sprout earlier when the soil temperatures are cooler compared to warm season. So that's why getting them out early with the soil temperature being a little bit lower will work. Another reason to get cool season crops in the ground early, even if you don't go from cold to hot as quickly as we do, there's still a reason to get them in early, and that is so you can get them out and have the ability to succession plant a crop behind it. Now, if you're in a mild climate, that succession planting may be another cool weather crop that can make it through your summer. But if you're like me and you're in a warm climate, then that succession crop is going to be a summer crop. This is one of the best ways that I can get more harvest out of my space, is to plant these cool season crops early so that I can get them out and put a new crop back in. With the example of spinach, I mentioned that it typically bolts around middle of April, which is right around our average last frost date. So that makes spinach followed by something like tomatoes or cucumbers or squash a perfect succession planting. And then you get these two crops out of the same space. With lettuce, it doesn't start bolting usually in my climate till about mid-May, which is about a month after my average last frost date, which is the perfect time to plant okra or sweet potatoes or some of those warm loving crops. So being able to get these cool season crops in the ground early, get them harvested, get them out, allows you a second succession in that space, which makes you better able to maximize the space that you have. Now, this is all going to sound very familiar for students of Dream to Garden, my online garden planning course, where I'll walk you through how to calculate all of this for your climate. And while Dream to Garden is closed right now, it will open briefly in April. So if you want to get on the wait list for that, you can go to journeywithjill.net/dream2garden, and we'll have that link in the description if you're interested in that. The next thing that we want to talk about, and this is a question that I get a lot this time of year, especially if you've done a garden plan and you know about when you want to plant these crops, maybe 4 to 6 weeks before your average last frost date, and the time has come. As I'm recording this, the time has come. So when that calendar date arrives, are those plants actually ready to go in the garden? And is the garden ready for those plants? Just because that it says on your garden calendar that you need to plant this crop at this time, you still want to observe some things in your garden and in the crop itself so that you can make the best decision on when it should actually grow in the ground. So the first thing that I want you to ask yourself and to observe, go out in your garden, is your soil ready? That's a big question. And I think that there's a lot of variance here with climates, because I notice that this time of year, especially if we get some warm, sunny days, the soil is drying out. It's most of the time ready about this time. But some of you may still be getting some snows or some freezes. Maybe your ground is just starting to thaw. Your soil may not be ready. So don't feel like just because the calendar says 4 to 6 weeks that you have to plant. Look at your soil. Is your soil ready? One thing you can do, though, to get your soil ready is you can take steps yourself to warm the soil. This is a step that a lot of people, especially in cooler climates, they do to be able to get these crops in the ground. You want to rake off any mulch. Maybe you covered your ground with mulch the year before. Rake that off, because what you want is you want the sun to be able to shine on that soil to warm it up. It will help to dry it out also, which is going to be helpful. You don't want to plant in soggy soil. And it'll also help the soil warm up, which will be helpful not only if you're direct sowing crops, but also if you're planting transplants, making sure that that plant is able to have an ideal temperature to be able to thrive when you plant it in. The problem if you plant out in too cold and too wet, and especially those two things in combination can be catastrophic. I've done it, is that the seeds can rot in the ground. So we don't want to plant our seeds if it's too cold and too wet. Personally, I have found that to be less of a problem with cool season crops than warm season crops. I've had it more to be the case with like beans and cucumbers, but it's still never a good idea if your ground is just saturated and your soil is just so cold. When in doubt, wait. Another thing is that transplants are also, even though you're planting them in the ground and you're not having to wait for germination, they also won't take off all that great if you're planting in really cold soil. I mean, think about it. If somebody knocks you from your inside temperature of 70 degrees and you go out and it's 40 degrees, I mean, are you going to be like, hey, let's go? I mean, some of you guys will. I mean, maybe you like cool weather, but I'd be like, nope, I'm just going to bundle up here. I'm not going to do anything. And I think sometimes that's the way our plants can be. So soil temperature is important for transplants too, just maybe not as important as for seeds, because the seeds do have to take that extra step to germinate. I have had many springs where the issue has been too cool of soil, too wet of soil, lots of rains, lots of cold. But this year, it's been the opposite. So let's bring this question to you. What if spring is appearing to come early? I think a lot of us have been in that boat this year. Spring has started to arrive a little bit early, and you may be wondering, okay, like even today, I'm recording this in late February and the highs are in the upper 80s. Now this is crazy, and it's thankfully this is the last day of this nuts weather, because I don't know how well our plants can handle that sustained in February. But the thing is that you have to make an educated or a gut decision on some of these things. And I'll tell you what I've done in the past, and I'll tell you how it's worked for me. I personally, if I am getting near to that 4 to 6 week mark that I have put on my calendar, so March 1st is usually my target for these cool season crops. Anytime after Valentine's Day, if we start to have consistent warm weather and my transplants are ready, I'm going to be talking to you about this in a little bit. If they're of a good enough size where I feel like they're ready to go out, or I'm planting from seed, and I look at my 7-day forecast and I don't see any temperatures below freezing, I will go ahead and plant. And the reason is because even though cool season crops are frost tolerant and they can take a freeze, I don't want to make them have to establish if they're going to get ready to be thrown into freezing degree weather. Even though the plant itself is going to be resilient in most cases, anytime you transplant a crop, it's still a shock to the system. Even if you're transplanting from soil blocks or epic cell trays like I use, where there's minimal root disturbance, it's still a difference. So I want to be able to plant when I can see that there's a string of a week or so, if possible, of mild temperatures. And then my goal is to get those plants established because I know a freeze is going to come back, right? I mean, our average last frost date isn't until April. So of course a freeze is going to arrive in March. It always does. But then if it does come in the next week or two, I can cover with a floating row cover if necessary. Now, I would not do this more than a couple weeks in advance because you don't want to plant your crops at the whim of nature because you never know what it's going to do. But if I'm only a couple of weeks away from when I was going to plant it before, then yeah, I'll go ahead and plant it if the temperatures seem right for them to get established. When it comes to planting seeds in the ground, obviously, it's going to be a little bit of time before they germinate, so I don't really look at that too much when it comes to, okay, well, it's going to be freezing when they come up. That doesn't bother me so much. They're actually pretty resilient at that stage. What I'm looking at instead is the soil temperature. Did that stretch of really nice weather after I raked off the mulch and all that, did it warm up the soil temperature to about 50 degrees? Now, some of these crops can germinate in soil temperature as low as 35 or 40, but understand that the germination time may take longer. It's just the way that the seeds are, and we want them to be like that. We want them to germinate. We want them to germinate when the time is right. Understand that the higher the soil temperature is, understanding there's a ceiling there, you don't want it too high, the faster that the germination is going to happen. For example, when I'm planting carrot seeds in my spring garden, I know that it's probably going to take 2 to 3 weeks before I see germination. Whereas if I'm planting them in the fall, it will take less than a week. That's all due to soil temperature. Same way with peas. I usually plant peas at the beginning of March, and sometimes it can take up to 2 weeks to see those sprouts. In the fall, days. It could be so much quicker. So soil temperature is definitely a consideration. So if you get that nice stretch of spring weather in your direct sowing crops, I would take the soil temperature. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute. But let's move back to transplants. Let's say you have a transplant. I just transplanted my broccoli and my cabbage seedlings. One thing you want to make sure and do is harden them off. I know hardening off is something we talk about a lot when it comes to like tomatoes and other warm season crops, but you need to harden off your cool season crops just the same. The sunlight is starting to get stronger the more we get into spring, so we're going to need to gradually acclimate them to the sunlight, especially if we have sown them indoors under grow lights. The sunlight and the grow light are not the same. The sunlight's going to be stronger, so we want to gradually put them outside. We also want to gradually expose them to the wind. That's something that, at least in my area, the wind is much stronger in the spring, so they're going to need to be stronger. So we're going to gradually expose them to that. And I like to leave them outside. Now, I usually keep them in my greenhouse, but you don't have to. Before I had a greenhouse, I didn't. I like to leave them outside at night, especially when the temperature is going to dip in the 40s or so. I don't want to leave them outside in a freeze. Not at this point, not when they're still in their cell trays because they're going to get really cold. But if you know it's not going to freeze, I like to leave them out at night, get them used to these nighttime temperatures. So we definitely don't want to skip that step. So let's say you've got your timing and hey, we have a nice spell here, but my plants have been under grow lights and they haven't been outside yet. Don't be in a rush to get them outside. They may not survive. Make sure that they have been properly hardened off. Remember, these crops can take a frost and most of them will do just fine in a freeze, but not right away. You don't want to expose them to that right away. You want them to establish for several days, up to a week, before you see any weather stresses. Going back to seeds and soil temperature, those of you who are members of Dream to Garden, you know that on your Common Crops cheat sheet, I have lists of soil temperatures for all the crops that's ideal for germination. But if you are not a member of Dream to Garden, you can just Google like a particular crop you're getting ready to plant. What's the best soil temperature for carrots? And usually one of the extension websites will come up and those are reliable and that will tell you what you need for that particular seed. A lot of people ask me, what soil thermometer do you use? I bought one, or I think I was given it, but it's on Amazon and I have it in my Amazon storefront, which is basically my favorite gardening things off Amazon. You can go to journeywithjill.net/Amazon to check that out. I think it's under the garden tools section, but it's not very expensive at all. So, and mine has lasted me for years and years. I've only had to change the battery once. And what you want to do is you want to stick the probe into the soil about no more than an inch deep or so, just because you want it to test the soil temperature where the seed is going to be. So if it's a larger seed, it's going to be further down like a pea, but if it's a smaller seed, it's going to be, further up like a carrot or lettuce seed. And you want to try to do it at dawn if possible. I've made the mistake of taking soil temperatures in the middle of the afternoon in a sunny day when it's in the 70s, and that reading is going to be completely different than if you take it at dawn when it's gone through the night. That's going to be a more accurate soil temperature. So that's how you'd want to check your soil temperature. I have to be honest, I don't do this like I used to, mainly because I've learned to see the signs. Even yesterday, I was clearing off a bed where I'm going to be planting potatoes, and I could just feel with my hand it was still a little bit too cool. So that's something, though, for beginners, I really recommend that you do, because one reason that I don't find that I have to do it anymore is because I've taken the soil temperature so much. I kind of get a read on when it's ready and when it's not. But still, the soil thermometer is definitely a tool that I think is very helpful. Finally, let's go to what to do after planting, because it's always a little nerve-wracking to plant cool season crops when you don't know what's coming as far as weather goes, especially when it comes to freezes. So here are some things that you can do to make sure, if you decide to go ahead and get them in the ground, to make sure that they get off to their best start. The first thing, if you're planting seeds, ensure they have plenty of water until they germinate, especially smaller seeds, because the smaller the seed that you plant, the more close to the surface that they're going to be. Rule of thumb, if you're a beginner, is you want the depth of the seed to be about twice the diameter of the seed itself. For like a pea, you're going to plant it about, half inch to an inch down. But if you're talking about a lettuce or carrot seeds, barely scratching the surface. So if those seeds are very close to the surface, they're naturally going to dry out faster, especially if you get windy days. That's why with carrots, I cover mine with a floating row cover. Some people use cardboard boxes, some people use burlap sacks, and I'm watering on top of that just about every day so I can make sure that they do not dry out. The second thing with seeds is you want to be patient. As I mentioned, it can take 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the seeds, for you to start seeing germination. Understand that when you're planting this time of year, it'll take longer for those seeds to emerge. And then I personally don't worry about covering my seedlings. Like if you start to see germination, I don't cover them unless I see temperatures go down to the low 20s, which is pretty uncommon at this time of year for my climate. But if you see that that's a possibility, I would probably cover it just to be safe. But what I found is most seedlings, especially when they first germinate and even up to the adolescent phase, they're actually really resilient. The exception that I found, we did have a cold snap a couple of weeks ago and we got down to 20. Some of my arugula seeds, arugula lasts all winter in my climate, they did not make it. So I think, it was just a little bit too cold for them. So that's why I'm saying low 20s probably I would cover. Other than that, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if in doubt, cover. Like I would hate for you not to cover because, Jill said low 20s and then it's 25 and then you lose your crop. So cover if in doubt. And the only reason that I've kind of figured out when I'm going to cover and when I'm not is because I've tested it and I'm observing it every year, and you'll learn those things too the more that you do it. What about transplants? Well, when you're planting your transplants, water them well at planting. Fill the planting hole with water, put the transplant in, move your soil back around it, water again. And then I personally would recommend that you take care not to water too much after that, unless you check put your finger in the soil and it's dry, then maybe water. But what you will find, or what I have found, is that this time of year, it does not, the plant does not take up a whole lot of water. Number one, because it's still small. Number two, because the air temperature is not super high. With the exception of today, I will probably be watching my transplants in the upper 80s. But most of the time, if we're in the 60s or 70s or even 50s, there's just not going to be as much transpiration, which means the plant is not going to lose or use as much water. You're not going to lose as much water from the soil, so you're not going to have to water as much. And a lot of times we're getting rain this time of year, so they're getting water through rain. You do not want to overwater your transplants, because if there's not enough oxygen in the soil, the roots could rot before they have a chance to get established in the ground. So I would caution you against overwatering. Another thing you can do is add mulch. This will help to mitigate heavy rains. If you have heavy rains, also it'll keep water in the soil. Add mulch. Don't fertilize right away. I don't do a lot of fertilizing, especially in raised beds and ground beds. Containers, I will, but I want to wait until they're established. So you want to definitely make sure they're established before you start feeding them fertilizer. And then cover if a freeze comes within a week. And then I would say watch and cover until you notice growth in your plants, which signals that they're starting to be established. You may need to take pictures of your plants to see that, because the growth is so incremental, especially if you're out in your garden every day, that you will not notice when they start to establish and start to grow. So take pictures, and I would cover until you're secure that they have established well. And I would still cover in general most of these crops if it's below, say, the upper 20s. Just understand that a lot of these crops, they can take a freeze, and usually upper 20s it's okay, but especially with young plants, it wouldn't hurt to cover them, especially if there's a hard freeze coming. Anytime you can protect them from that, it's going to be good. Just use your judgment on that. Today, we've talked about when to plant when it actually comes, but next week, we're going to continue this conversation. My assistant, Sarah, is going to be coming on the podcast, and she is going to be asking me questions that you all have asked about planting and growing cool season crops. We actually asked this question on Instagram. So if you want to follow along on Instagram, it's @thebeginnersgarden. And we just posed a story question. What questions do you have about cool season crops? And we got a lot of great ones. We're going to be talking about things like covering and how to deal with these fluctuating temperatures and direct sow versus transplanting. We're going to be talking about all of these things in next week's podcast. So make sure that you're subscribed. It'll be a fun Q&A session. We did one of these last year and people really seem to like it. And answering your questions is always a lot of fun. So make sure you're subscribed either here on YouTube if you're watching, or if you are listening to the podcast on the go, and you'll be able to get more discussion on cool season crops next week.